Pearl Cooper had put a bullet through the eye of a weather-vane rooster at 400 yards when she was 16 years old, and not a single soul in Redemption Creek had ever asked her to do it again. That was the way of things in a small town carved out of the red dirt of West Texas in the year 1882. Women who could outshoot every man from the Rio Grande to the Pecos River were not celebrated in Redemption Creek. They were tolerated, the way you tolerated a rattlesnake that had, so far, chosen not to bite you. Pearl understood this arrangement without ever having been told it outright. It lived in the way Reverend Hollis nodded at her from across the street with something behind his eyes that was not quite admiration. It lived in the way the boys at the feed store went quiet when she walked past the rifle rack on the wall. It lived in the silence of her father, Thomas Cooper, who had taught her to shoot when she was 8, and then spent the rest of his years pretending he had not. Thomas Cooper was dead now, buried 3 years past in the cemetery on the hill east of town, beside Pearl's mother, Adeline, who had died of fever before Pearl ever learned to braid her own hair. What he had left her was 80 acres of decent grazing land, a farmhouse that leaked when it rained, a bay mare named Crescent, and the kind of reputation that kept people at a comfortable and respectful distance. Pearl was 24 years old and she had never been in love, had never come close to it, and had, on most mornings, managed to convince herself that she did not miss it. On the morning that changed everything, Pearl was mending fence line on the south pasture when Junie Alderman came galloping up the road on her old spotted gelding, waving her bonnet like she was trying to start a fire with it. Junie was Pearl's nearest neighbor and her closest friend, 26 years old with 3 small children and a husband, Frank, who ran the post office. Junie was the kind of woman who always seemed to be arriving somewhere just barely in time, slightly breathless, with news. "Pearl," Junie called out, pulling up her horse with considerably more drama than was required. "They have hired a new man over at the Lazy D. He came in on yesterday's stage." Pearl set down her wire stretchers and looked at Junie without urgency. "Frank Delacroix has been trying to hire a foreman since March." "Not a foreman," Junie said, sliding down from the saddle with practiced ease. "The man is a cattle buyer. His name is Harvey Bancroft. He is from Missouri, I think, or maybe Kansas. Frank is not entirely sure because he addressed his own letter oddly. He is 28 years old. Junie. He is also," Junie continued, ignoring the warning in Pearl's voice completely, "quite something to look at if you take the time to look, which you never do, but perhaps you should start." Pearl picked up the wire stretchers again. "I have 60 yards of fence line left." "The fence line will keep," Junie said cheerfully. "Men like that do not." Pearl did not go into town that day or the next. She finished her fence line, repaired a loose board on the north side of the barn, and spent an evening cleaning her father's Winchester repeating rifle, which she kept above the fireplace mantel out of sentiment and habit. She had her own rifle, a newer Winchester model 1873 that she kept oiled and loaded, but her father's gun was the one her hands remembered first, the one that had shaped the particular steadiness of her fingers. She did not think about Harvey Bancroft. She thought about him only 3 times before she finally saw him, which she considered a reasonable score. The first time was when she rode into Redemption Creek to collect her mail and noticed that the Lazy D's wagon was hitched outside Caldwell's Mercantile, and she found herself glancing at the doorway just a moment longer than she needed to. The second time was when Junie came by with her youngest on her hip and mentioned, quite casually, that Harvey Bancroft had bought himself a proper hat at the dry goods store, a dark brown one with a cattleman's crease, and had then helped old Mrs. Whitmore carry her parcels all the way from the store to her house on the corner without being asked. The third time was when Pearl could not sleep, which happened sometimes on hot nights when the Texas wind came through the windows smelling of dry grass and distance, and she lay on her back in the dark and thought that the world was very large and her 80 acres of it were very quiet. She saw him for the first time on a Saturday, which was market day in Redemption Creek, when the street filled up with wagons and horses, and the particular noise of a small town trying to conduct the week's business before the afternoon heat drove everyone indoors. Pearl was at the feed store with two 50-pound bags of grain waiting on the counter when the door opened behind her, and she heard a voice say, "Excuse me, I am told this is where a man gets a straight answer about the price of hay." She turned around because the feed store was small and the voice was close, and she found herself looking at a man of about 6 feet, lean through the shoulders in a way that suggested hard work rather than youth, with dark hair that had been recently cut and not recently combed, and eyes that were a shade of brown that Pearl had no ready name for, the color of creek water in late October when the leaves had already fallen and the sky sat low above it. He was looking at her, not at the counter, not at the bins of grain along the wall. He was looking at her the way people looked when they were genuinely curious rather than politely attentive, and Pearl, who was accustomed to being looked at sideways, found it strange enough to stare back for a full 2 seconds before she remembered herself. "Straight answers about hay cost 15 cents a bale and Will Caldwell gives them for free," she said, and turned back to the counter. She heard him laugh, quiet and genuine, before he stepped up beside her and waited his turn. His name was Harvey Bancroft, which she already knew. He did not tell her that right away. He said, "I did not mean to interrupt your order," and she said, "You did not." And Will Caldwell looked between them with the expression of a man who had decided this was interesting enough to remember. Harvey Bancroft paid for his hay and Pearl paid for her grain, and they walked out of the feed store at the same time, because the door was only wide enough for one person, and they both reached for it at the same moment, and then both stepped back. And Pearl thought the whole thing was ridiculous enough to be funny, which meant she smiled, and he seemed to find her smile the most interesting thing he had seen since arriving in West Texas. "Harvey Bancroft," he said on the boardwalk in the morning sun. "Cattle buyer for the Lazy D. I have been here 10 days and have not yet gotten lost, which I am counting as a considerable achievement." "Pearl Cooper," she said. "I run the Cooper place on the South Road. You passed it coming into town." "The one with the good fence line," he said, and his tone was a note too knowing. She looked at him more carefully. "You noticed my fence line." "A man who buys cattle for a living notices fence lines the way other men notice weather," he said. "Yours is well done. Whoever mended it this week knew what they were about." Pearl had not told him she had mended it herself. She did not tell him now either. She simply said, "Good morning, Mr. Bancroft," and collected her grain bags from the boy who had loaded them onto her wagon, and drove home with her face set into its usual composed expression and her mind doing something entirely less composed than that. She thought about his eyes. October Creek water. She was irritated with herself for the comparison, and even more irritated when she could not come up with a better one. The following Sunday, Junie Alderman organized a dinner, as Junie organized most things in Redemption Creek, with the precise inevitability of someone who had decided what was going to happen and simply created circumstances in which it could not fail to. The dinner was at the Alderman place, 8 people around a table built for 6, and Harvey Bancroft was invited because, as Junie explained to Pearl with wide eyes full of total innocence, Frank had met him at the post office, and he seemed like a decent man who could probably use a home-cooked meal. Pearl wore her good blue dress, which she told herself was because she wore it every Sunday and it had nothing to do with anything else. Harvey Bancroft sat across from her at dinner, which again was Junie's doing, arranged with all the subtlety of a cavalry charge. He was quieter than Pearl had expected from that first conversation. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak it was with a directness that Pearl recognized and respected, a man who said what he meant and did not ornament it beyond usefulness. He had grown up on a farm in Kansas, near a town called Independence, and his father had been a cattleman and his mother had been a schoolteacher, and he had inherited, by his own account, an impractical combination of those two influences, meaning he could read widely and ride hard, and had no particular talent for staying in one place. He had come to Texas because Frank Delacroix's Lazy D was one of the best-run operations in the county, and because he had heard the Pecos country was worth seeing. "Is it?" Pearl asked. He looked across the table at her. "The country or the people?" "Either." "Both," he said, "as it turns out." Junie refilled everyone's water glass with the expression of a woman deeply satisfied with herself. After dinner, when the men had drifted out to the porch and the women were clearing the table, Junie took Pearl's arm and whispered, "Well, he seems like a sensible person," Pearl said. "Pearl Cooper," Junie said, "you are absolutely infuriating and also clearly smitten." Pearl took the dishes and walked into the kitchen and did not answer, which was, she recognized, itself a kind of answer. On the porch, she found herself beside him later, when the evening had cooled, and the fireflies were beginning their deliberate work in the grass below the steps. Frank and his neighbor, old Ed Tasker, were arguing companionably about the price of cattle futures in Abilene, and Junie was inside settling the youngest child, and for a few minutes Pearl and Harvey Bancroft were standing in a pocket of quiet that belonged to just the two of them. "You grew up here?" he asked. "Born here," she said. "My mother was from Virginia originally, but she came west with my father when she was young and she never went back. She used to say there was nothing in Virginia that Texas could not do more extravagantly." He smiled at that. "And your father? He died 3 years ago. I run the place alone now." He did not say he was sorry in that reflexive, meaningless way some people did. He said, "That is a lot of work for one person," and the acknowledgement was worth more to her than any condolence. "I manage," she said. "I expect you manage very well," he said quietly. She looked at the fireflies in the grass for a moment. "Do you always say exactly what you mean?" "I try to," he said. "I have found the alternative wastes a great deal of everyone's time." She laughed, genuinely, for the first time in what felt like a long while, and he looked at her with such open pleasure that she felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the Texas evening. She rode home alone in the dark and told herself it was only dinner, only conversation, only one evening. She was halfway convinced. Over the following weeks, Redemption Creek being the small and interconnected place that it was, Pearl and Harvey Bancroft kept finding themselves in proximity. He tipped his hat to her outside the post office. She nodded to him at the cattle auction where she sold 2 steers. He appeared at the church social in early September because Frank Alderman had apparently told him it was not optional, and he found himself beside Pearl at the pie table, and they spent 40 minutes talking about everything and nothing, about Kansas winters and Texas summers, about whether the railroad expansion would reach Redemption Creek within the decade, about the particular quality of light on the plains in the hour before sunset. He had a quality that Pearl had not often found in men, a willingness to take seriously what she said. When she offered an opinion, he considered it. When she disagreed with him, which she did twice on the subject of whether the big ranches were good or bad for small land owners, he listened to her argument and said, "I had not thought about it that way," without the faint trace of condescension that usually accompanied such phrases when men said them to women. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments. In the middle of morning chores, feeding Crescent or collecting eggs from the henhouse, she would surface from some errand to find that her mind had been turning over something he had said, the way you turned a river stone in your hand and found unexpected color on the underside. She did not know what to do with any of it. She was not accustomed to wanting. It felt, she thought, like learning to use a muscle she had not known she had, awkward and slightly painful and accompanied by the persistent suspicion that she was doing it wrong. In early October, Harvey Bancroft rode out to the Cooper place on a Monday afternoon, which was not a social day, and knocked on her door. Pearl was in the yard splitting wood, which was not how she had imagined she would look the first time he came calling, if she had imagined it at all, which she had, briefly, once or twice. She set the axe down and waited. "I came to ask if you would ride out to see the canyon country with me on Saturday," he said, still on his horse, his hat in his hand. The hat business was unnecessary and she liked it. Delacroix says the red rock formations near Yellow Horse Creek are worth seeing. I thought, if you were willing, the company would be better for the sharing of it. Pearl looked at him for a moment. The sun was going down behind him, turning the sky over his shoulder into something frankly spectacular, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was very tired of being sensible. "Saturday," she said, "I will bring provisions." The ride to Yellow Horse Canyon was 15 miles and took most of the morning, and Pearl discovered over those miles that Harvey Bancroft could ride very well, which she had suspected, and that he was as comfortable with silence as he was with conversation, which she had hoped. They rode side by side on the open plain and talked when they had something to say, and did not when they did not. And the quiet between them was easy in a way that quiets between people often are not when two people are still learning the shape of each other. At the canyon they sat on a red rock ledge above the creek and ate the bread and dried meat and dried apple slices Pearl had packed, and they watched a red-tailed hawk work the thermals above the canyon walls, and Harvey Bancroft said, "I think this might be the finest place I have ever been." And Pearl looked at the canyon, all its impossible color piled up against the blue sky, and said, "Yes," very simply, and then found him looking at her rather than at the canyon. "I was not entirely talking about the canyon," he said. Pearl looked back at him. She had a particular stillness when she was paying attention to something, a quality that other people sometimes mistook for coldness, but was in fact the opposite. It was the stillness of someone taking a thing seriously. "I know," she said. They sat there for a long time, while the hawk circled, and the creek ran over its stones far below, and the afternoon light began to soften toward gold. On the ride back, somewhere on the open plain with Redemption Creek still a good hour away, Harvey said, "I should tell you that I have not been here long enough to know everything about this place or its people. But I have been here long enough to know that you are the most particular person I have met in a long time." "Particular," Pearl said, turning the word over. "I mean it in the best sense," he said. "You are exactly yourself. It is not a common thing." Pearl was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say I was too much of everything for my own good," she said. "Too direct, too independent, too unwilling to do the quiet thing when the loud thing was true." "He sounds like a man who did not always know what to do with what he had," Harvey said, carefully. Pearl felt something shift in her chest, some old tightness she had grown so accustomed to carrying that she had ceased to notice its weight. "That is fair," she said. He reached across the space between their horses and touched her hand, very briefly, the lightest press of his fingers against her knuckles, and then took his hand back. It was not a bold gesture. It was a careful one, the gesture of a man who understood that some things could not be rushed without being broken. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, but she was aware of every inch of the distance between them. October turned to November, and the courtship, if that was what it was, continued in the way of things in small towns and open country. He came by on Sundays sometimes. She passed the Lazy D's gate on her way to the alderman's, and sometimes he was in the yard and lifted a hand in greeting. They ate dinner at Junie's 3 more times, and Junie had entirely given up pretending. She was not engineering these occasions and simply told Pearl directly, "I am inviting Harvey again because the two of you together are good for my soul." And Pearl accepted this without fighting it. She showed him the north pasture one afternoon, where her father had planted a line of cottonwood trees along the fence that now stood 30 years grown, enormous pale trunks against the November sky, leaves gone gold and rattling. Harvey walked among the trees with his hands in his coat pockets and his face turned up, and Pearl stood a little apart and watched him be present in her world, in the place her father had made, in the land she had held alone, and felt something she had no name for that was also something she finally recognized. She was falling in love with him. She was not falling in any direction at all, actually. She had fallen, quietly, in the manner of something that happens before you see it happening, and she was now simply standing in the place where she had landed, looking around. He kissed her for the first time under the cottonwood trees, which she later thought was almost too beautiful to be real, except that it was entirely real. The dry leaf smell and the rattling branches, and the cold of the November air and the warmth of his mouth, brief and entirely certain. And when he pulled back, he looked at her with an expression she had never seen directed at herself before and could now not imagine going without. "I have been wanting to do that for 7 weeks," he said. "I know," Pearl said, which made him laugh, and then she kissed him again herself, which stopped his laughing, and they stood under the cottonwood trees in the cold November afternoon, and the pale leaves came down around them. Junie Alderman, when told, made a sound like a kettle coming to boil and hugged Pearl until Pearl made a small sound of protest, and Junie said, "Do not argue with me, Pearl Cooper. This is my moment too." Frank Alderman shook Pearl's hand and said he was very glad and meant it simply, which was the best kind of glad. Redemption Creek received the news of Pearl Cooper keeping company with Harvey Bancroft, with the mixture of approval and speculation that small towns brought to all romantic developments. Mrs. Whitmore, who was 70 and had seen everything and taken the measure of most of it, stopped Pearl on the street and said, "He seems like a man with good sense, which is rarer than good looks, which he also has. Well done." Reverend Hollies shook Harvey's hand after Sunday services and told him that Pearl Cooper was a fine woman, and the county was lucky to have her, and Harvey agreed in a way that suggested he had already arrived at this conclusion without assistance. The town had a particular relationship with Pearl that Harvey came to understand gradually, the way you come to understand a landscape by living in it. They respected her. They were slightly in awe of her. They also held her at a certain remove, as though she were a phenomenon of the local geography rather than a person. He asked her about this one evening when they were sitting on her porch after supper, in the comfortable way they had developed of simply being together without ceremony. "They know I shoot," Pearl said. Harvey looked at her. "Most people out here shoot." "Not the way I do," Pearl said. She said it without pride or apology, plainly the way she said most true things. "My father taught me when I was 8. By the time I was 12, I could outshoot him. By the time I was 16, I was better than anyone in the county." Harvey was quiet for a moment, genuinely thinking, and that makes them uncomfortable. "Women are not supposed to be better than everyone at the thing men prize themselves on most," Pearl said. "Out here, that is shooting. A woman who can do it better than a man is either an oddity to be displayed or a threat to be managed." "And you prefer to be neither," Harvey said. "I prefer to be left to manage my own 80 acres, Pearl said. "Which I do. The shooting is mine. It does not need an audience." Harvey was quiet again. Then he said, "I have never seen you shoot." Pearl looked at him with something small and considering in her expression. Then she stood up, went inside, and came back with her Winchester. She loaded it without looking at her hands, her eyes on the far end of the yard where a row of fence posts ran along the property line, perhaps 300 yards out. She raised the rifle, settled it against her shoulder with a naturalness that Harvey later described only as something he had no proper word for, and fired 5 shots in the space of about 4 seconds. 5 fence posts, 5 shots, each one striking the same notch she had cut into the tops with her axe years ago as a practice marker. She lowered the rifle, reloaded, and looked at him. Harvey Bancroft, who had grown up around men who could shoot and considered himself a reasonable shot in his own right, said nothing for approximately 10 seconds. Then he said, "Pearl." "Yes," she said. "That was," he said, and stopped. "Yes," she said again. He stood up and kissed her, right there on the porch in the early winter evening with the smell of powder still in the air, and Pearl laughed against his mouth and thought that perhaps she had been wrong about not needing an audience, at least in this particular case, for this particular person. December came in cold and clear, the way December in West Texas sometimes did, Not the brutal cold of the plains further north, but a dry, biting chill that made the stars sharp and close, and the mornings creak. Pearl and Harvey were as certain of each other as two careful people can become in 2 months of being sure, which is to say they were certain enough and still finding new things. He took her to the Christmas dance at the church hall, and Pearl wore her best dress, which was not the blue one but a deep red one she had made herself 2 winters past, and almost never worn because there had been no occasion that seemed worth it. Harvey looked at her when she came to the door and said, "You are going to ruin every other woman's evening." And Pearl said, "Harvey Bancroft, that is a very silly thing to say." And he said, "I know," and offered her his arm with perfect seriousness. They danced. Pearl had not danced in several years and discovered that she had missed it, the particular pleasure of being in motion with someone else in a way that required trust and coordination and produced something that neither person could have made alone. Harvey danced well, better than she had expected, with a relaxed ease that came from clearly having done it often and enjoyed it. "Missouri," he said when she mentioned it. "People dance in Missouri. People dance everywhere," he said. "You just have to be willing." She was aware from time to time of people watching them, Mrs. Whitmore with open approval, Reverend Hollis with his usual measured expression. A few of the younger men who had, at various points over the years, shown half-hearted interest in Pearl and retreated at the first sign of her self-sufficiency, watching now with expressions she could not quite read and did not particularly care about. She cared about Harvey's hand at the small of her back. She cared about the way he looked at her when the fiddle player went into a slower tune, and they moved together in something closer to an embrace than a dance. And the church hall was warm with bodies and candlelight, and it was Christmas. And she thought, privately and with the particular clarity of a moment that knows itself to be important, that this was the best Christmas she had had since her mother died. She told him that later, walking back to where her wagon was hitched, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. He took her hand, her bare hand in the cold, and held it and said, "Tell me about her." So Pearl told him about Adeline Cooper, who had been from Virginia and had crossed the country in a wagon with Thomas Cooper when she was 19 years old, who had made a garden in West Texas soil that everyone said would not grow anything, who had taught Pearl to read and to sew and to hold her own counsel, who had been sick for 3 months before she died and had told Pearl, very seriously, 2 weeks before the end, that the greatest mistake a person could make was to become so good at surviving alone that they forgot how to share themselves. Pearl said this last part and stopped. Harvey was looking at her in the winter dark, his eyes very steady. "She was right," Pearl said quietly. "She sounds like she was a very wise woman," Harvey said. "She was," Pearl said. "I wish you could have met her." "I wish I could have too," Harvey said, with such simple sincerity that Pearl felt the fullness of it somewhere behind her sternum. He drove her home in her wagon, hitched his horse to the back, and at her door he kissed her good night in the cold with such thorough care that she stood on the porch for a long moment after he had ridden away, listening to his horse's hoofbeats fade into the winter silence, and felt the whole of herself adjusted, somehow, into a slightly different and more comfortable arrangement than it had been in before. January was when everything changed, and not for any reason Pearl could have anticipated or prepared for. It began with a man named Cord Ratliff. Cord Ratliff was not from Redemption Creek. He was from nowhere in particular, which was how you described a certain kind of man who moved through the West in those years. A man who had no fixed address and a shifting collection of associates, and a general orientation toward taking what was available rather than making what was needed. He had been working a ranch up near the Pecos for part of the previous year, and before that there were rumors of various sorts that Frank Alderman had heard through the Postal Service's unofficial intelligence network, which was considerably more comprehensive than the official one. Ratliff arrived in Redemption Creek in the second week of January, with 3 men who were very clearly in his employ, and the kind of lazy ease that comes from having done something like this before. He set up at the Redemption Creek Saloon, which was a modest establishment called the Plainsman that served reasonable whiskey and gave no trouble to anyone as a matter of general policy. And within 3 days, he was making himself known in the way that such men did, by being present at every transaction, by listening to every conversation, by learning who owed whom and who had what, and where the weak points were. The weak point he identified was the Lazy D. Frank Delacroix was a fair man and a reasonable rancher, but he was also 63 years old and had been fighting a persistent illness since the fall that had kept him indoors more than out, and had generally reduced his visibility around the property. The Lazy D ran 120 head of cattle and represented the largest single concentration of livestock value in the county. Ratliff's interest in it was not subtle to anyone who was paying attention. Harvey was paying attention. He had been watching Ratliff's men for a week, noting where they rode in the mornings, how they spent their evenings, when they came and went from the saloon. He mentioned his concern to Pearl one afternoon at the Cooper place, and Pearl listened with the same stillness she brought to everything important and said, "You should talk to the sheriff." The sheriff of Redemption Creek was a man named Dale Corrigan, who was competent and honest, and was also the brother-in-law of one of Ratliff's associates, a connection he had perhaps not sufficiently disclosed to anyone who might find it relevant. Harvey went to the sheriff's office and laid out what he had observed. Corrigan listened, made notes, and said he would look into it. He looked into it in the sense that he walked past the plainsman on his afternoon rounds and nodded at Ratliff, who nodded back, and nothing further occurred. Harvey reported this to Pearl and to Frank Delacroix, who was well enough to receive visitors that week, and they agreed that the situation required watching. Delacroix told Harvey to keep his eyes open, and Pearl, sitting in her kitchen on the South Road, began thinking about the Winchester above the fireplace and her own newer rifle in the corner, and the feeling that settled over her was not fear exactly but a sharpening of attention, the kind that comes before something you cannot yet name. On the night of January the 14th, which was a Wednesday, clear and very cold, with a full moon that turned the plains silver and stripped away all shadow, Harvey Bancroft stayed late at the Lazy D going over the cattle records with old Frank Delacroix, and then rode out at about 9 o'clock in the evening, taking the road toward Redemption Creek where he was boarding at Mrs. Calhoun's boarding house. He did not make it to Redemption Creek. About 2 miles from the Lazy D, where the road ran through a dry wash and then up a short rise and into a stand of mesquite trees that lined the creek bank, Cord Ratliff and 3 of his men were waiting. They had chosen the spot well. The creek bank trees were dense enough to conceal horses and men. The moon was bright on the open road before the trees but made deep shadow inside them. Harvey did not see them until he was already past the dry wash, and the first man stepped out into the road and his horse shied, and he had 2 seconds to understand what was happening before they were on 3 sides of him. "Step down," Ratliff said, from the shadow of the mesquites, his voice conversational, almost pleasant. "We have been wanting a word with you, Mr. Bancroft, about your employer's cattle and what you have been telling the sheriff about honest men's business." Harvey looked at 4 men with drawn weapons and calculated his options with the speed of someone who had spent enough time in rough country to know when a situation had teeth. Getting off his horse increased the odds they did not shoot the horse, which was a good horse and had done nothing wrong. It also put him on the ground surrounded, which was where they wanted him. He dismounted. "Whatever you have heard," Harvey said, "I am willing to discuss it." "That is very agreeable of you," Ratliff said, moving out of the shadows now into the moonlight, showing himself, which was the gesture of a man who did not expect to leave a witness. "What I would like to discuss is your agreement to leave Redemption Creek within the week. The Lazy D is going to be changing management shortly, and Delacroix's pet cattle buyer is not part of the new arrangement." Harvey said, "Mr. Delacroix is not planning to sell." "No," Ratliff agreed pleasantly. "He is planning to have an accident. Men of his age and his condition do, after which his estate, having no heirs present, will be acquired at a fair valuation which I will determine." Harvey understood then the full shape of it. This was not a warning, or it was a warning, but it was one that came after a decision had already been made, and the decision was not about cattle prices. He was thinking, in the way people think when they are frightened but trying not to be, about whether he could reach the rifle in his saddle's scabbard before the nearest man could fire, and was concluding that the answer was probably no, when he heard something that took him a long moment to identify. A sound. From the darkness across the creek, beyond the mesquites, from the open plain on the south side. One shot. It took the hat off the nearest man's head without touching the man, which was either extraordinary marksmanship or the most spectacular piece of luck anyone in that wash had ever witnessed. The hat flew sideways into the mesquites, and the man let out a sound that was somewhere between a yell and a prayer and grabbed his head with both hands. Everyone froze. A voice came from the darkness, from out on the open plain where the moonlight ran flat and silver, and there was no cover for a person to hide behind, meaning whoever was speaking was simply standing in the open, in the clear, bright night, at a distance Pearl later estimated at just over 300 yards. "The next one," Pearl Cooper said, her voice carrying easily in the cold air, steady as the North Star, "goes through the gun hand of the man on the right. After that I will take my time." Ratliff turned toward the sound. He could not see her. The moonlight played tricks on the plain, and she had, with considerable forethought, positioned herself with the moon behind her, meaning anyone looking in her direction was looking into silver light. "Who is out there?" Ratliff called. "The woman," Pearl said, "who has been patient long enough and is now out of patience entirely." Harvey Bancroft, standing in the middle of the road with 4 men around him, felt something move through him that was too complex to name in the moment, and that he would spend a considerable amount of time afterward trying to describe accurately. It was not relief, though relief was part of it. It was something more like the sensation of the world revealing a dimension he had not previously perceived, something that had been there all along and had simply been waiting for him to understand it. Ratliff said very quietly to the man beside him, "Find her." The man on the right took one step into the mesquites, and Pearl put a bullet into the tree trunk 6 inches from his nose. He stopped moving. "I can see every one of you," Pearl said. "The moon is very helpful tonight. I have 5 rounds left in this rifle, and I can reload in the dark. Mr. Ratliff, I suggest you think carefully about what you do next." What Ratliff did next was think visibly for about 10 seconds. 4 men, guns drawn, and somewhere out on the open plain a shooter who had already demonstrated, in 2 shots, something that made the arithmetic of this situation considerably less favorable than it had appeared 10 minutes ago. "This is not finished," Ratliff said, but the pleasantness was gone from his voice, and what had replaced it was the cold, flat tone of a man who was retreating without admitting it. "You should ride north," Pearl said from the dark. "Tonight, and tell your men to ride with you. I know where each of you boards, where you eat, and where you water your horses. I am on 80 acres, and I am not going anywhere. You have been warned once." There was a long silence. An owl called from somewhere downstream in the mesquites, enormous in the quiet. Ratliff turned his horse. His men, with various degrees of haste and dignity, did the same. They rode north, which was the direction Pearl had specified, and the sound of hooves faded up the road, and then there was only the creek noise and the cold and the silver moonlight. Harvey stood in the road. Pearl walked out of the darkness after a moment, coming down off the plain and into the wash, her rifle at her side, her breath making small clouds in the cold, her boots crunching on the frozen grass. He looked at her. He did not say anything for what felt like a very long time. "How did you know?" he finally said. "Junie's husband Frank works the post office," Pearl said. He noticed Ratliff's man posting a letter earlier today that described the road schedule out of the Lazy D. Frank brought it to me because he did not trust Corrigan. I rode out. 300 yards, Harvey said. In the dark. "The moon was very helpful," Pearl said, which was what she had said from the darkness, and there was a small and contained amusement in it that he recognized as the way she laughed when something was serious, but also, from a sufficient distance, slightly absurd. "Pearl," he said. "Yes." He stepped forward and took her face in his hands, and looked at her for a moment with an expression that she would later tell Junie was the most thoroughly seen she had ever felt in her life. And then he kissed her in the road in the January cold, with the mesquites rattling around them and the creek running beneath the frozen mud. And it was nothing like the careful, tentative kiss under the cottonwood trees. It was the kiss of two people who have just discovered something important about the world and about themselves and about each other simultaneously, and who are responding to that discovery with appropriate enthusiasm. When they stopped, Pearl said, "Your horse ran off." Harvey looked around. The horse was indeed gone, down the road toward the Lazy D at what had presumably been a considerable speed. "That is," he said, "a reasonable response to tonight." They walked back to the Lazy D together in the dark, Pearl carrying her rifle, Harvey leading Crescent, who Pearl had ground-hitched in the wash and who regarded them both with the philosophical patience of a horse who had learned not to be surprised by the behavior of people. Frank Delacroix was still awake when they arrived, and he listened to what Harvey told him with a face that went through several expressions, and settled finally into something resolute and not inconsiderable in its anger. He sent one of his hands to rouse the county judge, a man named Erasmus Webb, who had no family connection to Cord Ratliff and had, in fact, been suspicious of Sheriff Corrigan for some time. By morning, two things had happened. Ratliff and his men were located by Judge Webb's specially deputized party, camped on the North Road 10 miles out of town, and were taken into custody on charges that included conspiracy, armed intimidation, and a variety of associated crimes that Erasmus Webb, who was a thorough man, had been composing in his head since midnight. And Sheriff Dale Corrigan was relieved of his position pending an investigation into his associations, an investigation that ultimately resulted in his departure from the county by mutual agreement with the county commissioner. Ratliff and his men were taken to the county seat for trial and did not return to Redemption Creek. The threat to Frank Delacroix's operation was over. It was over because Pearl Cooper had ridden out alone in the January night with her rifle, had stood in the open moonlit plain at 300 yards, and had made a decision about what she was willing to protect. Redemption Creek, small town that it was, learned everything about this within approximately 24 hours. Pearl had been the best shot in the county since she was 16 years old, and had never had a reason to prove it that seemed worth the display. Until the night Harvey Bancroft was surrounded in the wash by Cord Ratliff's men, and she rode out because she had decided, somewhere between fear and certainty, that he was worth every one of those years of practice. The reaction in town was, to Pearl's private bemusement, considerably warmer than she had expected. Mrs. Whitmore told her she was a credit to the county and everyone should know it. Ed Tasker bought her a drink at the Plainsman, which was not something that happened to women in Redemption Creek as a general rule, and Pearl accepted it because she had earned it and because Ed Tasker meant it well. Reverend Hollies gave a Sunday sermon on courage and community, in which he mentioned, without naming her, a woman of their congregation who had demonstrated both. Pearl sat in her pew and looked at the middle distance and felt Harvey's hand find hers in the space between them on the bench, and she held on. The day after the ordeal in the wash, Pearl and Harvey sat at her kitchen table in the morning light with coffee and the remains of the breakfast she had cooked, because her hands had needed something to do, and they talked, with the particular honesty that sometimes comes after fear has stripped away the usual careful layers. "I want to stay," Harvey said, "in Redemption Creek. I have been thinking about it for some time, and what happened last night confirmed something I had already been arriving at." Pearl looked at him. "Buying cattle for the Lazy D, that yes," he said, "and other things." She waited. "I would like to buy land," he said. "I have some savings." There is a parcel adjacent to the Lazy D on the east side that Delacroix mentioned might be available in the spring. 40 acres. It is not much, but it is a start. That is a good parcel, Pearl said. Good water access. I know, he said, and then with the directness she had come to know and expect from him, I am telling you this because I am not leaving, and I am not leaving because of you, and I think you should know that directly so you can decide what to do with it. Pearl set down her coffee cup. Harvey Bancroft, she said, you are a very plain-speaking man. I find it saves considerable time, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had come to Redemption Creek on a stage from Missouri or maybe Kansas, who noticed fence lines and took her opinions seriously and danced with genuine ease and held her hand in the cold, and had looked at her in the road after the most frightening night of her recent life with more total attention than anyone had ever brought to bear on her existence. Stay, she said. It was one word, but she said it with the whole of herself behind it, and he heard all of it. In February, Harvey asked Frank Delacroix about the east parcel, and Delacroix said yes, and named a fair price, and they shook hands, and Harvey began making plans. In the same week, he asked Pearl something else. On a quiet Sunday evening on her porch with the winter sunset burning out over the plains in shades of orange and deep red, and what he asked was whether she would be willing to marry him. He asked it simply, sitting beside her in one of the two porch chairs, turning his hat in his hands, looking at her with the October Creekwater eyes. He said, I know this is fast, for some definitions of fast, and I know you are a person who does not need any particular arrangement to manage her own life and her own land. I am not asking because I think you need it. I am asking because I want to share this country with you, this specific piece of it and this life, in every way that is possible, and because being married to you would be the finest thing I can think of. Pearl looked at the sunset for a moment. You are a very good man, Harvey Bancroft, she said. I try to be, he said. Is that a yes? Yes, Pearl said, and the word came out warm and clean and without any of the careful hesitation she might have expected from herself. That is very much a yes. He put the hat down and kissed her, and the sunset went on burning, and the plains stretched away to the horizon in every direction, enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and Pearl Cooper felt herself at the exact center of her own life in a way she had not expected to ever quite manage. They were married in April, in the Redemption Creek Church, in front of a congregation that included everyone Pearl knew and a great many people Harvey had collected in the course of his months in the county, because it turned out that a man who was honest and fair and helped old women carry packages had, without particularly trying, made himself known and liked. Junie Alderman cried, which was expected. Frank Alderman made a speech at the dinner afterward that was funny and kind, and concluded with the toast that they had both earned this, which Pearl thought was perhaps the most accurate thing anyone said all day. Pearl wore a new dress, made from fabric she had ordered from the dry goods store in October, a deep cream wool, not white, because she was a practical woman with careful work at the collar and cuffs, and Harvey, looking at her across the church, had an expression on his face that made Mrs. Whitmore, sitting in the third pew, press her handkerchief briefly to her eyes. Harvey's 40 acres were taken in hand with the same focused energy he brought to everything, and over the following season he cleared and fenced and dug a well, and laid the foundation for a small house that was not built yet, because he and Pearl were still at the Cooper place, which was larger and more established and more sensibly occupied than 40 mostly bare acres. They talked about the future with the practical directness that had characterized everything between them, and what they agreed was that the two properties, adjacent on the South Road, would work together, that Harvey would work the cattle buying for the Lazy D while also building his own small herd, and that the combined enterprise of the Cooper place and the Bancroft 40 would be enough to build something real on. That summer, Pearl discovered she was expecting a child. She told Harvey on a July evening in the kitchen, standing at the stove, because she had been trying to find the right moment for a week, and had finally concluded that the right moment was the moment you said the thing, and there was no arrangement of furniture or light that would make the saying of it more or less significant than it was. Harvey, who had been sitting at the table with the ranch accounts, went very still for a moment. Then he stood up and came across the kitchen and held her, not dramatically, just steadily, his arms around her and her head against his shoulder, and the summer evening coming in through the window with the smell of dry grass and the sound of insects. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very well," Pearl said. "I am also slightly terrified, but I expect that is normal." "I expect it is," Harvey said, and she felt him exhale, felt him settle into the fact of it. "A baby." "In January," she said. "January," he said, and she could hear him thinking, turning it over, making the adjustments that a man makes when the world he had been planning is suddenly revealed to be a slightly different and larger world. "That is a very good month." "It is a cold month," Pearl said. "We have a good fireplace," he said, "and I intend to make certain it is kept full." She laughed, and he held her tighter for a moment, and outside the summer evening continued its business. And Pearl Cooper, who had become Pearl Bancroft in April and had not yet grown entirely used to the new sound of it, thought that her mother had been exactly right, that the greatest mistake was to become so good at surviving alone that you forgot how to share yourself, and that she had not made that mistake after all. Or had made it, and had been given the good fortune to be pulled back from it, by a man who came in on a stage and noticed fence lines. The autumn was full and busy in the way that ranch autumns always were, with the fall cattle drive and the winter provisions, and the endless work of two properties being managed as carefully as they could be managed. Harvey hired a hand, a young man named Tobias from the Pecos country, 18 years old and serious about learning the work, and Pearl taught him things about horses and land management that he received with grateful attention and told his mother about in his letters home. Frank Delacroix, whose health had somewhat improved since the stress of the Ratliff business was resolved, came to dinner at the Cooper place twice that fall and declared it the finest cooking he had encountered since his wife had died in '79, and Pearl accepted this with equal grace and insisted he come more often. Junie Alderman appeared at least twice a week, sometimes with her children, sometimes without, and sat in Pearl's kitchen with the comfortable intimacy of a woman who had been in that kitchen in every mood and weather for most of a decade. She helped Pearl make things for the baby, small things from cotton and wool, and they talked about everything under the Texas sky. And Junie said sometimes simply, "I am so happy for you, Pearl," in a way that was entirely without agenda or complication, and Pearl said, "I know, Junie," and meant it as a receipt for something valuable. The boy was born on the 2nd of January, 1883, in the bedroom of the Cooper place, with the winter wind running outside and the fireplace doing exactly the job Harvey had promised it would. He was born at 2 in the morning, which is the most determined hour for such arrivals, with Junie in attendance and old Mrs. Whitmore, who had, it turned out, delivered half the babies in Redemption Creek over the past 30 years and was calm and capable in a way that Pearl, in the hours preceding, was extremely grateful for. Harvey, in the outer room with Frank Alderman and a pot of coffee, heard the small and furious announcement of the new person at 2:17 in the morning, and sat down very suddenly in the kitchen chair, and put his face in his hands for a moment in the way of men who have been holding something at considerable tension and have just been permitted to release it. When Junie came to the door and said, "Come," he went. Pearl was propped up in the bed with a quantity of quilts and the expression of someone who had just done something extremely difficult and was prepared to do it again if necessary. She was holding the baby, which was very small and very pink, and was regarding the world with dark blue eyes that had not yet decided what color they were going to be. Harvey sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both and said nothing at all for a long time. "He is very loud," Pearl said, which was true. "I think he gets that from your side," Harvey laughed, shaky and genuine. "I am one of 5 children. We were all loud." Good, Pearl said. He will fit in when we go to Missouri. Harvey looked at her. You want to meet my family? I want our son to know his family, Pearl said. Come spring when travel is reasonable. Harvey leaned forward and kissed her forehead and then looked at his son, and Pearl watched him looking, watched the thing move across his face that she had no name for but recognized as the same thing she felt, which was something like love's closest and most complete cousin. What shall we call him? Harvey asked. Pearl had thought about this. Thomas, she said, for my father. And James for yours. She had asked months ago what Harvey's father's name was, and he had told her, and she had filed it away. Harvey said Thomas James Bancroft, with the careful attention of a man testing the sound of it. Yes. Thomas James Bancroft weighed 8 pounds and was the most demanding person in the county by a significant margin. And Pearl managed this with the same focused competence she brought to everything. And Harvey, who was an involved and attentive father in a way that occasionally surprised the men of Redemption Creek, who considered such involvement somewhat beyond the usual scope of masculine duty, was present for the early mornings and the difficult nights and the general beautiful chaos of a new child, with an unwavering steadiness that Pearl observed and loved. Spring came slowly and then all at once, the way spring did on the Texas plains, and with it the travel Harvey and Pearl had discussed. They made the journey to Kansas in May, Pearl and Harvey and Thomas at 4 months old, on the train from the county seat, which had gotten its rail connection the previous autumn. Harvey's family was in Independence, and they were exactly what Pearl, if she had been constructing families from available materials, might have hoped for. His mother, Margaret, was a schoolteacher who had educated 3 generations of Kansas farm children, and who took Pearl's hand in both of hers when they arrived and said, I have heard so much about you, and I am so glad, in a way that was warm without being overwhelming. His father, James, was a large, quiet man who looked very much like Harvey would look in 30 years, and who shook Harvey's hand and then embraced him in the way of a father who had missed his son, and then held Thomas at arm's length and said, well, with considerable satisfaction. Harvey's siblings, 4 of them, were varying combinations of warm and curious and forthright, and they asked Pearl direct questions and received her direct answers with appreciation, and the sister nearest Harvey's age, a 26-year-old named Clara, took Pearl aside on the second day and said, he wrote to us about you in October and I have been waiting to meet you since. What did he write? Pearl asked. He said, Clara said, with the particular precision of a woman who had memorized a letter from her brother, that he had met a woman who was exactly herself and that this was the rarest thing he had ever encountered and that he was not certain what to do about it but that he was not going to do nothing. Pearl sat with this for a moment. Then she said, he did not tell me that. No, Clara agreed, men rarely do, but they write it to their sisters. They stayed 2 weeks in Kansas, and Pearl, who had not been anywhere but Texas in her entire life, found the country interesting, and the people kindly, and the whole experience of being known in the context of Harvey's life, rather than Pearl Cooper of Redemption Creek, both strange and widening, like opening a window in a room she had not known had one. Thomas charmed everyone, which he would continue to do throughout his life with the easy grace of someone born knowing his own welcome. They came home to Texas in June, and the plains spread out from the train window in every direction in the early summer green, and Pearl watched the familiar country arrive around her and felt, with uncomplicated certainty, that this was her place, and that it was different now because it was shared. The years settled in around them with the pace and texture of real life, which is not the pace of crisis or courtship, but something slower and richer and more interesting than either. Harvey's 40 acres were gradually built up, his own small cattle operation established alongside his work for the Lazy D, until by 1885, the Bancroft enterprise was genuinely self-supporting, and Frank Delacroix, whose health had declined again in the winters, was talking about the possibility of leaving the Lazy D to Harvey in some formal arrangement, which they discussed seriously, and with mutual respect over many evenings at Delacroix's table. Pearl's 80 acres continued to run well. She had kept her father's land as hers in name and spirit, and the combined property of the two adjacent places made for something the county took note of as a well-run and substantial holding. Pearl still mended her own fence line when it needed mending, still managed the herd with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it alone since she was 21, and still cleaned her rifles on Sunday evenings with the careful habit of a woman who understood that competence required maintenance. She had, since the night in the wash, found that her reputation in Redemption Creek had altered subtly. Not dramatically, not in any way that changed the fundamental nature of what a woman could do or be in West Texas in the 1880s, because the fundamental nature of such things changed slowly and incompletely, and with considerable resistance. But the quality of the town's regard for Pearl Bancroft had shifted from respectful wariness to something closer to genuine esteem, and she noticed the difference, and it was not nothing. She was asked, in the spring of 1885, by the new school that the town had organized, to come and speak to the older children about marksmanship and land management, which she did once, and which went well enough that she was asked again. She went again, and the time after that, and found that she liked it, the particular satisfaction of teaching something you knew well to people who were genuinely interested, and she began making it a regular occurrence, not just shooting, but the broader curriculum of managing land and livestock and resources, the things her father had taught her, and the things she had learned on her own in the years she had run the place alone. Harvey, watching this develop, said one evening, "You are teaching them things they do not teach in the regular school." "No," Pearl agreed. "The regular school teaches them reading and arithmetic. I am teaching them how the land works." "Someone should," Harvey said simply. She looked at him. "Your mother was a school teacher." "Yes," he said. "Do you think I would be good at it?" she said, "as a real thing?" He looked at her with the complete attention that had never diminished, not in 3 years, not in all the ordinary days and difficult ones, that essential quality of his that made her feel worth looking at. "Pearl," he said, "you would be extraordinary at it." She thought about this for several months, turned it over the way she turned problems, thoroughly and from multiple angles, and eventually spoke to Erasmus Webb, who was now the county judge proper and a man of some influence, and to the school board, which was less receptive than she had hoped but more receptive than she had feared. And the result was that, in the fall of 1885, Pearl Bancroft began teaching 2 afternoons a week at the Redemption Creek School, a class in what was officially called practical land science, and what was unofficially understood to be Pearl teaching the children of the county how to be competent in the specific environment they had been born into. She loved it with a thoroughness that surprised her and did not surprise Harvey at all. Thomas, who was 2 and then 3, and then a determined 4-year-old with his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn precision, came to the school with her sometimes and sat in the back with a serious expression, and occasionally asked questions that were better than the questions of some of the older students, which Pearl managed without allowing herself to be visibly proud, which was difficult. In the summer of 1885, Pearl learned she was expecting again. She told Harvey in the kitchen again as she had the first time, and he came across the room and held her in the same steady, certain way, and she put her face against his shoulder and breathed in and felt herself, as she always did in his arms, exactly where she was supposed to be. "Another January," he said into her hair. "Late November, I think," she said. "A Thanksgiving baby," he said. "Or a December baby," Pearl said practically. "Either is acceptable," Harvey said, and she felt him smiling against her hair. The second child was a girl, born on the 28th of November, which was close enough to Thanksgiving that Junie Alderman declared it a gift of the season and brought 2 pies to the Cooper place, 1 berry and 1 apple, and they ate them in the kitchen with Thomas perched on Harvey's knee, demanding to be introduced to the new person, whom he had decided was interesting. They named her Adeline, for Pearl's mother. Adeline Margaret Bancroft, the second name for Harvey's mother, who wrote from Kansas that she was overwhelmed with gratitude and that they had chosen beautifully. Adeline was different from Thomas in every particular. Where Thomas had announced himself loudly, Adeline watched. She had Pearl's stillness and Harvey's brown eyes, and a personality that declared itself early as formidably thoughtful, the kind of child who considered a thing from 6 angles before acting on it and was therefore, by the time she did act, usually correct. Frank Delacroix died in the winter of 1886, peacefully, in his own bed, with Harvey and Pearl and 2 of his oldest hands present. He had made a will that had surprised no one who knew him and only mildly surprised Harvey, leaving the Lazy D in its entirety to Harvey Bancroft on the condition that he maintain its operation and its staff fairly, which Harvey had already been doing and intended to continue. It was a significant thing. The Lazy D at 120 head, combined with the Bancroft 40 acres and Pearl's 80, made the Bancroft family one of the larger landholding operations in the county. Harvey received this with the seriousness it deserved, and Pearl received it beside him, and they sat together that evening after the children were asleep and talked about what they owed to the opportunity and what they intended to make of it. "I want to run it the way Frank did," Harvey said. "Fair wages, reasonable hours, treating the men like men." "Yes," Pearl said, "and I want to expand the school program if we can afford to contribute to it." "We can," Harvey said. "We should." They were not wealthy in the way that the big Texas cattle barons of that era were wealthy, the kind that owned tens of thousands of acres and ran operations the size of small countries. What they were was prosperous in the way that means sustainable, stable, built on honest work rather than exploitation or speculation, and carrying its fair weight in the community. Pearl was aware, as she had always been aware, of the particular structure of injustice that shaped the world she operated in. She had navigated it since she was a girl, the way it narrowed what women were supposed to want and do and be. She had also watched it operate against people who did not have even the latitude that a white woman in West Texas had, and she did not look away from that. There were families in the county, Mexican families who had been on this land before Texas was Texas, who were steadily being pressed from their claims by the same kind of legal manipulation that Cord Ratliff had attempted with Frank Delacroix. There were other injustices, larger and older than any one county. She could not solve all of it. She was not large enough for all of it. What she could do was run her own operation without adding to it, and she did. She hired fairly and paid fairly. And when a man named Raphael Reyes, who had worked the Cooper land seasonally for her father, came to her in 1887, needing a full-time position because his own small claim had been lost to a legal dispute, she hired him without equivocation and paid him the same as anyone else, which in Redemption Creek in 1887 was not a universal practice and was noted. Harvey, who had seen similar things in Kansas and held similar convictions, supported every decision she made without needing to be persuaded, because they had talked about these things in the ordinary way they talked about everything, and their positions were, on the things that mattered most, closely aligned. By 1887, Redemption Creek had grown. The rail connection that the town had finally secured made it a more significant point on the regional map, and new families arrived, new businesses opened, the school expanded its building, and the shape of the town's future became clearer and more real. Pearl's teaching program had been formalized into the school curriculum, a development that had required considerable persistence on her part and the strategic assistance of Erasmus Webb, who remained a reliable ally. Junie Alderman, who had organized the dinner that started everything and had been absolutely right about all of it, was now 31 and had 4 children, and ran the post office when Frank was away, which was increasingly often because Frank had expanded his small business interests and spent more time at the county seat. Junie and Pearl's friendship was one of the things Pearl counted as a fundamental feature of her life, as fixed and necessary as the land itself. On a June evening in 1887, Pearl and Harvey sat on the porch of the Cooper place in the warm evening with the two children playing in the yard below. Thomas at 4 running in the complicated pattern of a child who is too full of energy to move in a straight line. Adeline at 1.5 sitting carefully in the grass and examining a blade of it with profound concentration. Pearl was watching the children and Harvey was watching Pearl, which was something he still did with the same attention he had brought to it from the beginning, and she felt it in the way you feel familiar warmth, known and received. "I was thinking," Harvey said, "that we should build." Pearl looked at him. "Build?" "Add on to this house," he said, "a proper parlor and another bedroom and fix the north wall that still leaks when it rains sideways." Pearl looked at the house, her father's house, the one she had lived in every year of her life. "It needs work," she acknowledged. "I would like to do it properly," Harvey said, "before the next one arrives." Pearl turned to look at him with a very specific expression. Harvey had the expression of a man who is attempting to look innocent and is not quite achieving it. "Is there something you would like to discuss, Harvey?" Pearl said. "I thought," Harvey said carefully, "that you might want to tell me first." Pearl looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I was going to tell you tonight." "I know," he said. "I have been trying to wait politely." "How long have you known?" 2 weeks, he said. "You have been eating crackers before breakfast." Pearl laughed genuinely, the full laugh that Harvey had collected as one of his most valued possessions. "You are impossibly observant," she said. "Fence lines and breakfast habits," he said. "I have always been particular about what I notice." She shook her head at him and he reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and they sat together on the porch in the June evening, while their children played in the yard below them, and the Texas sky went through its nightly ceremony of color, and the land stretched away in every direction, enormous and known and theirs. The third child arrived in December, a boy they named William, after no one in particular and for no reason other than that it suited him, which it did. William Bancroft was a sunny and uncomplicated person from his first week of life, disposed toward cheerfulness in the way that some people are disposed toward it as a natural condition, and he was the favorite of everyone who met him without any of those people having the self-awareness to recognize that they had a favorite. 3 children and 2 properties and a school program and a cattle operation were, Pearl reflected in the quieter moments of 1888, a considerable amount of life. It was a full life. It was a life that had required her to be every version of herself she had ever possessed. The careful shot who could put a bullet through a weather-vane rooster at 400 yards, and the girl who had learned to braid her own hair, and the woman who had run 80 acres alone, and the person who had been willing, finally, to share herself. She had not expected to have all of this. She had not, at 24, with her fence line and her rifle and her father's grave on the hill, been able to see it from where she was standing. She thought sometimes about the version of herself that might have continued on in that solitude, managing competently and alone, and she did not despise that version. She recognized her, but she was glad to be the one who had chosen differently. Harvey caught her in this kind of thinking once, on a winter morning when the children were not yet awake, and the kitchen was quiet, and she was standing at the window looking out at the pale dawn light on the snow that had come in the night and turned the plain silver. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming up behind her with the unhurried ease of a man entirely at home in this house, this kitchen, this morning. "Nothing in particular," Pearl said. He came to stand beside her and look out at the snow. "That is not true," he said gently. "I was thinking about how things turn out," Pearl said. "How different they can be from what you expected." "Better or worse?" he asked. She looked at him. He was looking at the snow, the same October Creekwater eyes that she had found her name for at some point and had held onto, though she had never told him the comparison and did not particularly plan to, as it would make him insufferable about it. "Better," she said. "Considerably better than anything I had the sense to expect." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him. And outside the snow lay over the Cooper land and the Bancroft 40 and the Lazy D and the whole of the country around Redemption Creek. And it was beautiful in the way that simple, Honest things are beautiful, which is completely and without apology. In the spring of 1889, when the children were 4 and 3 and 1, Pearl took Thomas out to the far fence line on a Saturday morning on Crescent while Harvey managed the other two at the house, and she showed him how to sight a rifle, the way her father had shown her, the same patient instruction in the same open air. Thomas was too young to do it properly yet, but he was the right age to understand that this was something serious, something careful, something worth the attention he brought to it. Pearl showed him the stance, the way the shoulder receives the stock, the way the breath slows before the trigger moves, and Thomas listened with the gravity of a 4-year-old encountering something he recognizes as real. "You have to be patient," Pearl said. "The shot waits for you, you do not chase it." "Where did you learn?" Thomas asked. "From your grandfather," Pearl said. "From my father, who learned from his." Thomas considered this line of transmission, one generation to the next, the knowledge passing through hands. "Will you teach Adeline too?" he asked. "Yes," Pearl said without hesitation, "and William when he is old enough." Thomas nodded, satisfied by the justice of this. Pearl lowered the rifle and looked out across the plains, the wide Texas morning, the sky enormous and blue and full of the particular promise of spring, and felt the whole of her history here, the roots of it going down through her father and her mother to something old and real. She would teach her children what the land required. She would teach them patience and accuracy and care. She would teach them to fix fence line and red weather and treat people fairly. She would teach them that the best shot in the county does not always need a reason to prove it, and that sometimes the reasons come to you, unexpected and urgent and important, and that when they do, you should be ready. She would teach them that being ready is an act of love. Adeline Bancroft, at 79 years old, would tell the story of her mother's ride in the January night to her own grandchildren, and they would listen the way children listen to stories that are also true, wide-eyed and still. She would tell them about Pearl Cooper, who could put a bullet through a weather-vane rooster at 400 yards when she was 16 years old, and who had kept that skill quietly and carefully for 8 years until the night she needed it, and who had ridden out alone in the moonlight because the man she loved was surrounded, and she had decided that this was exactly the reason she had been preparing for, without knowing it, all her life. She would tell them that Pearl never spoke of it as something heroic. That she spoke of it, when she spoke of it at all, with the same matter-of-fact quality she brought to everything, as a thing that needed doing and that she happened to be equipped for. She would tell them that Harvey Bancroft, who had come to Texas on a stage and noticed fence lines and helped old women carry packages, had told the story quite differently, with the full weight of what he had felt in that road in January with 4 men's guns on him, and the shot coming out of the darkness and Pearl's voice, steady as the North Star, offering terms. He had told it as what it was, the night he understood completely what he had been falling in love with, which was not just a woman but a particular kind of courage, the quiet kind that lives in the ordinary days and the careful hands and the patient years, and that rises when it is needed, clear and certain and equal to the moment. Thomas James Bancroft, who grew to be a tall and capable man with his mother's eyes and his father's way of saying exactly what he meant, ran the Bancroft properties with considerable skill and fairness for 30 years after Harvey retired from the active work. He married a woman from the county seat named Eleanor who was, Junie Alderman said at the wedding, exactly right, which was the highest compliment Junie had on offer. Adeline Margaret Bancroft became, in an outcome that surprised no one who had known her mother, a teacher. Not at the Redemption Creek School, though she had attended it. She went to the county seat and then further, and came back with proper credentials and a conviction about what children deserve to learn, and she taught for 40 years and was remembered by everyone who sat in her classrooms. William Bancroft, the sunny, uncomplicated boy, became a rancher in the purest sense, more interested in the cattle and the land than in any of the human drama surrounding it, and he ran the Lazy D's main operation with a simplicity and competence that his parents recognized immediately as its own kind of intelligence. Pearl Bancroft taught at the Redemption Creek School for 16 years, until the school had grown large enough to need 3 full teachers, and the town had caught up to what she had always known about what children needed to understand. She watched the town grow up around her, watched it become less raw and more settled, watched the next generation of the county's children grow into adults who knew how to manage the land they had inherited. Harvey Bancroft remained, to the end of his days, the most consistently attentive person Pearl had ever known. He never stopped listening to her with the particular quality of attention that had first distinguished him to her in Caldwell's feed store in 1882, the quality of a man genuinely curious about what you were going to say next. He never stopped looking at her with appreciation she had long since accepted as real. On the evening of their 30th wedding anniversary, April 1912, they sat on the porch of the house that had been rebuilt properly in 1887 and renovated twice since, and the porch chairs were the same configuration they had always sat in, side by side, and the planes were the same enormous planes they had always been, and the Texas sky was doing what it always did at evening, which was to perform on a scale that made human concerns feel appropriately modest. Harvey said, "Do you remember the feed store? You asked if anyone could give you a straight answer about hay," Pearl said. "You told me Will Caldwell gave them for free," Harvey said, and turned back to the counter. "And you laughed," Pearl said. "I was already gone," Harvey said. "From that moment, I was not prepared for a woman who was that quick and that unbothered by me." "You were bothered by it," Pearl said. "Enormously," Harvey agreed. "It was the best thing that had ever happened to me." Pearl looked at the sky, the evening colors coming on, the particular light of a Texas spring evening at the end of a long and well-used day. "The fence line," she said. "The fence line," Harvey said, and she heard the smile in it. Outside the fence line she had mended in the late summer of 1882 ran along the south pasture, maintained now by Raphael Reyes's son, Eduardo, who had worked for them for the past 12 years and had learned the same standard from his father, which was Pearl's standard, which was to say thorough and without waste. The children, all 3 of them, would come for dinner on Sunday. Thomas's Eleanor would bring a cake. Adeline would bring her opinions about the county school board's recent decisions, which were, in Adeline's view, short-sighted. William would bring his considerable appetite and his good humor and would eat more cake than anyone else and apologize for it with such genuine charm that no one could object. Harvey's hand found Pearl's in the space between the chairs, and she took it, as she had taken it 1,000 times in 30 years, with the ease and sureness of something that had become essential without ever becoming ordinary. "Thank you," Harvey said. Pearl looked at him. "For what?" "For riding out," he said. "In January of '83, with the moon behind you, in the dark." "You were surrounded," Pearl said, as though it were obvious, which to her it had always been. "What else would I have done?" Harvey squeezed her hand. "I know exactly what you would have done," he said. "You would have done the right thing. You always do." Pearl looked back at the sky. The stars were beginning to appear now, one at a time, and then more quickly, the way they always did out here on the open plain, arriving in numbers that the smaller skies of other places did not permit. She had been the best shot in the county since she was 16 years old. She had kept that skill in the quiet way she kept most things, not hidden exactly, but private, not a display but a fact, waiting with the patient certainty of something that knows its own usefulness. The night she had ridden out with her rifle and her horse and the full moon at her back, she had been afraid. She did not often admit this, but it was true. She had been afraid in the way of someone who has chosen to do a difficult thing and is not certain it will go as planned. She had been afraid, and she had done it anyway, because Harvey Bancroft had come to Texas on a stage and noticed her fence line and looked at her with October Creekwater eyes and said exactly what he meant always, without ornament or pretension. and she had decided somewhere between the South Road and the moonlit plain that she was not willing to live in a world that had been diminished by the loss of him. She squeezed his hand back. The stars spread across the Texas sky in their ancient and indifferent abundance, and Pearl Bancroft, who had once been Pearl Cooper with 80 acres and a rifle and a very quiet life, sat on her porch with her husband's hand in hers and her children's laughter coming from inside the house where dinner was being prepared, and she breathed in the dry grass smell of the June evening, and she felt, from the soles of her feet to the top of her head, the full specific weight and beauty of the life she had made. It was enough, it was more than enough, it was everything.